Welcome back, everyone, to Catechumens Depart. I'm Eric Anderson.
And I'm Father Mark Kozak from the Assumption.
Let's start again.
No, that's all right. No. The Assumption of the Virgin Mary Church here in South Philadelphia.
This is the full unedited version today.
The why not?
The why not version.
The why not?
Good to see you all again. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be back.
Yes. If you've listened so far, we've been doing a bit of work on church history in general, trying to make sense of what it looks like to be an Orthodox person in a contemporary setting. And to do that, we kind of need to understand where we came from and where our setting kind of comes from. So we kind of got up through about the Protestant Reformation-ish, and then that kind of gives us the Renaissance, and we're kind of like, what is that? That's like the end of the Middle Ages, technically?
Yeah, the end of the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance is when the West discovered the myriad of things from the Greek East. And many people in the West don't understand that a lot of their knowledge, a lot of their thought came from refugees that came from the Eastern Roman Empire, from the Byzantine Empire. And it wasn't only the stories about the gods and so on and so forth, but it was thought in general from Socrates or from Plato, and then from art. Don't forget, El Greco was really Greek.
The Greek.
He was really from Byzantium. So we have to remember that Byzantium, in its last years, was really providing a spark, a major spark to the Renaissance. And that was almost across the board. So we have to understand that, not necessarily be proud of it, but certainly understand it.
I don't know if it's been longer than I'd care to admit since my art history courses in undergrad. Like, you get that a little bit, but I guess it seemed like the Italian Renaissance did come up with a lot of new innovations, but there's still like variations on a lot of existing Greek themes. A lot of the architecture is still sort of variations on Greek themes. And
well, yeah,
until you get further into it and it starts to splinter and get weirder.
And what you have to remember too, the architecture of South Italy, most of Sicily, part of Spain, the architecture that was used there was Byzantine architecture.
Yeah.
To the point of, you have churches in these parts of the Mediterranean that look like a Byzantine church. Mm-hmm. They have mosaics of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary in the right place. They have the saints. They have it looks like an Orthodox church because it was built probably by either students of Byzantine architectural folks or themselves that had escaped before the Turks had come in. Mm-hmm. So you can go to Sicily and South Italy today and encounter them. You know, they're still there.
That common heritage.
So, yeah.
So, yeah. See, now I'm failing my art history minor really bad right now.
Whoa!
Super
and I only
bad.
took one art history course.
I know, but yeah, I have no excuse. It's just I'll hang.
That's
my head.
okay. That's all right. It's
1997 was a long time ago now. So where do where do you want to start? Do you think that's probably a good spot?
I think that's probably a good place to sort of stop and say that there was a spark there, and we need to recognize the spark, not get too wrapped up into it. It can be a black hole by itself.
Yeah.
But historically, the Byzantine Greeks had a major influence on the Renaissance.
Yeah. But then the humanistic sort of bent of that came from what, like Platonic philosophy and stuff?
That came from an overwhelming sort of outbalanced view of Platonic philosophy.
Okay.
in the East, there was more of a balance with Socrates and Plato, and we lived with them for 1,200 years, 1,400 years before the West had rediscovered them again, because it was a rediscovery, is what happened. But that's the foundation. The Renaissance is the foundation of what's going to come up afterwards, and that's, of course, the Reformation itself. Yeah. Which was supposed to be this recovery and restoration of things in the Western Church, and it didn't really turn out that way.
No, and that was what, 1517?
That's 1520s, 1530s, and this sort of, the church didn't break, but the church in the West didn't break, but it fell apart in many ways, and it was super politicized before under one church, under the Roman Catholic Church. Now it was politicized under each of these groups. So you would have German princes and princes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire that were connected directly with one faith group. And everybody in their town and their province were connected with that. And then next door was someone that was connected with the Roman Catholics. And they fought each other, and it was brother and sister and mother and father, and it was a mess. And it was a theological mess too. We talked a little bit about that last time. I don't want to get into all the theological ramifications of the Reformation, but without a sacramental life, without a liturgical life, without a monastic life, what was left was the scriptures, and they talked about solely, soul scriptures and everything else, but it was their own particular interpretation of the scriptures.
Because they didn't have
because they didn't have anything else with it.
Right, they had no outside authority.
Yeah.
I was reading earlier today on that vast repository of unquestionable knowledge, Wikipedia.
Excuse me, I had a little coffee.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
Get you a tissue or something.
That's
maybe.
okay.
But actually, one of the sort of subheads in the article about the Reformation was pretty interesting, because it did posit that a lot of what the Reformation was a media revolution, because you had the printing press come into play at that point, and then you had everyone with access to scriptures and other materials in the vernacular. Luther and others were able to put out these pamphlets in vast numbers. So I thought that was an interesting little sidebar, because you can see that now echoing out in our new media revolution.
That jump,
that fragmentation
is as great as the jump that we're in now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to understand that. And we have to understand that during the time of the Reformation, because of the printing press, and because of that media intellectual jump that was happening, the intellectual class grew at a not alarming rate, but grew tremendously.
Yeah, because people had access to things that normally they would not have.
Yeah, so they went to school, they went to university, they had the nation states solidified. Lots of things happened during this time. I mean, England is an interesting example by itself. You have a royal family that had been nothing 25 years before, and at the end of the 1530s, the head of the royal family of England, Henry VIII, was the head of the English Church and controlled all the former monastic lands and so on and so forth, and had a great deal of power. It was a very jumpy time. It was, and I think that's why people like it, because they sort of like the personalities.
Yeah.
But what they don't get is that not everybody else, but a lot of other people were hurt and influenced by this.
Yeah.
You know, life changed dramatically.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's the very nascent beginning of the modern project of modernity, of that restless changing, that constant churn, that constant the idea of progress. Not that the ancient medieval world was necessarily static, but
No, but progress was different then.
Right, it wasn't thought of as like it's the be all end all in our world now,
Right.
and it's like that sort of gets its start, which is, you know, growing up in a Protestant paradigm, you basically got, there's Jesus. All right, he dies, he goes up to heaven. Paul like treks around a bit. Question mark 15, 17, Martin Luther.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, something sort of was going on between there, but it doesn't even fit into the way that people in our world think, because we think, well, you have step A, and then it has to be step B, and then it has to be, and so stepping back into that older pre-modernist mindset is difficult, but as part of kind of what I hope we can talk about over time here is like how we can adopt some of that as Orthodox people.
In the East, this was also an extraordinary hard time, because you had, on the one hand, the great church, the Church of Byzantium and the Eastern Roman Empire is now under the Turks.
Right.
Yes, the Patriarch of Constantinople is the head of the millet of Christians. That's what it was called in the Turkish Empire. The millet were all the Christians in the
millet.
That's what's called millet. That's what it's called. And but he was totally under the control of the Sultan. And when a patriarch died or a patriarch was removed, the Sultan would get 3 names and he would pick one of them. So
the Patriarchate remained in Constantinople, but it was just basically like a puppet.
Right. And then also what happened to, this is the whole Ottoman Empire, the whole Turkish Empire was involved with this. So the patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem and some of Alexandria were influenced by this too. So they became political pawns.
Which then you can kind of see the weakness of that's highlighted by Protestantism, I guess, sort of makes sense too, because maybe if that makes sense, right? They were really leery of church and state being combined.
Yeah, they although they did it in the beginning,
totally.
They bought it.
Yeah.
But then they became very leery of it, and rightfully so in some ways. In the East, it's not that the East went to sleep for 400 years and suddenly woke up and say, "Hi, here we are." Although there are many people in the West that who are Orthodox Christians and non-Orthodox Christians who believe that that we were asleep that entire time. Nothing happened, which wasn't true. We had a viable monastic life, a viable liturgical life. We had really bad problems with civil authorities. We had a growing church among the Eastern Slavs, especially with Russia. And that really brings us up to the end of the 18th century. And so we didn't have a Renaissance, we didn't have a Reformation, we didn't have an Enlightenment. We met the West during that crucial time of the 18th century. The first Orthodox chapel in the West was at the Russian embassy in London in 1676. So we know there was a priest there at that time, and they started to translate the liturgy into English at that time. But before that, I mean, there were embassies from the Turks and everything else, but there wasn't a lot of movement.
Yeah, there was just more of a continuity of practice without any great upheavals like you see going on in the West.
There were upheavals in the East, but they weren't the kind of things that happened in the West.
Yeah.
The church, of course, had the problem with the Byzantine Rite Catholics that we talked about a little bit last time. That's a whole story in itself, and that's a very volatile story by itself. But what's important here is that with the rise of Russia, and the Russian Church gets their independence in the late 1500s from the Church in Constantinople, and then it starts going from west to east and colonizing Siberia and eventually America and Alaska. And all those people become Orthodox. Not all of them, but many of them become Orthodox. Languages are founded. There's a whole theological academy in Kazan that's founded specifically to make missionaries to all of the native native Siberian and folks.
Oh, okay.
There are lots of good things that go on, but there are some bad things too. And one was Peter the Great himself and his direct successors were they weren't anti-church, they were a church. They weren't particularly interested in the church except as a department of state that they could control.
What's the relationship between the Russian state and the church at that point?
Before the early 1700s, before Peter's reign, the church and the state were very close, were a little bit too close. The first Romanov Tsar, his father was the patriarch. Oh my. That was a little bit too close.
Yeah.
The next set with Tsar Alexis and Patriarch Nikon, a very close relationship, and then there was a personal and theological split up between the two of them, which helped cause the Old Believer Schism.
Okay.
The Russian Church was relatively strong by the end of that century, but they had not encountered a ruler like Peter I, who basically came in and cleaned house everywhere and made the church into a department of the state.
Okay.
With a lay obro procurator, which means basically someone that was the head of the church.
Oh, okay.
And he ran the Holy Synod, and the Holy Synod and the obro procurator and the emperor ran the church, including choosing bishops and so on. Now that was what was happening in the East. In the West, we had the Enlightenment.
Ooh-ah.
Oh my.
So what does that encompass, right? You'll hear that term thrown around now and again, or often, depending on what you're reading. Like, kind of when is that? What is it? I know that's not super clear cut, but.
So we're looking at mid 1600s to early 1800s.
Okay.
And it's hard to sort of get a handle on it. It's sort of like a bowl of Jell-O, you know? But we can say there were people that were involved with the Enlightenment, from major political leaders like Catherine the Great of Russia, wrote letters to Voltaire, who was one of the great men that helped produce the Enlightenment. The revolutionaries in France that overthrew the Bourbon dynasty and made the French Revolution into a fact, into a reality, were victims, part of the Enlightenment. And our own greatest example of this is that our own founding fathers, many of them, were products of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And we have to remember this was their context. Mm-hmm. This is where they came from, their environment. And once we understand that as Orthodox Christians, then we can understand how religion and faith work here in America.
Yeah.
Which is another 200-year jump.
Yeah.
But what we read in our history books as children of, Puritans coming here to escape, being persecuted for their faith, and came to Massachusetts, and a similar group the Quakers came to Pennsylvania, and a similar group of Roman Catholics came to Maryland, and so on. Well, yes and no. Mm-hmm. But these people were products of the Enlightenment, and this was the hard side, the colonial side of the Enlightenment. And
what do you mean by the hard side?
This was not a pleasant place to be if you were using your free will properly, if you were a little bit outside of the box. I wouldn't be in early America.
No. Yeah.
Nor would I be in early anywhere else either.
True.
This was a big colonial time. I mean, Australia was being populated at this time. Mm-hmm.
Was that when the British were in India and Africa?
The British were in India, but not as it was interesting. The British were very interesting. They weren't in India as a government. They were in there as a commercial concern. The Russians came to Alaska at the end during this time, 1750s on, as a commercial concern, not as a part of the territory of Russia at first.
Okay.
We have the Russians and others have relationship with China at this time for commercial concerns, not out of great diplomatic endeavors right away. So there was a commercialism that was there before what happened in the 19th century.
Okay.
And we need to understand that as Americans. We need to understand that this is where we came from.
Yeah. And so, like, my understanding of the Enlightenment, is crude as it sort of is it comes out of Renaissance humanism. It comes out of the elevation of man, I guess, and then further elevates the rational faculty, and you end up a lot of times with what reads like dualism again.
Well, you end up with a number of gods. Mm-hmm. Some of them are not benign, but are less benign than others. Mm-hmm. You have the clockwork god. That's the god that comes in, and we're all like little cuckoo clocks, and he sets us up, and then he just lets us go.
Yeah.
There's the puppet god, and this is really what everybody wants God to be ultimately, but now in the 21st century it's the robot god. But it's the same thing, same god. We want to have free will, we want to try and use free will, but we really want God to tell us what to do. Mm-hmm. So God, could you just please work all the puppet strings and tell us how to do this? There's no mention of a creed.
Right.
No mention of Christ. Besides, he was a good guy. The Masons were relatively prominent. They were a group of fellow thinking people that came together not as a great conspiracy, but as a men's club at first.
Right.
And then they became involved with other power maneuvers and everything else that, came out of this time. So
were the Masons an American thing, or were they?
No, they started
global,
they were a global phenomenon, but we think that they started out in France and probably in England.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My dad was a Mason for a minute.
They were, and on the surface, and well into the surface, the Masons are a philanthropist. philanthropic, if that's a word.
Philanthropic.
Philanthropic. Thank you. I just made another word.
Join us for New Words Weekly.
Group of people that were interested in helping others. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why do we have to have secret ceremonies and everything? Why do we bring the Bible out? Why do we talk about Jesus during the, it's like, what are we doing here? Mm-hmm. So you mix that with the Puritans, the Quakers, the Roman Catholics, Church of England, the Glorious Revolution of 1682 in England, and it becomes this crazy place, America.
Yeah.
And this is where Protestantism really takes off.
Which, we have
to the point of, now 475 different Protestant faiths. The First Great Awakening happens in the middle part of the 1700s. The first tent meetings are at that time. Protestant ministers go out and preach to thousands of people and to change their lives and everything. And the change that a lot of them are talking about is making man great and making man better and making man God.
I think we'll stop on that. That's a good place to leave off for today, because we've managed helter-skelter to kind of... Everyone, this is my dog, Annie. So
this is Annie.
This is Annie. Welcome to the show, Annie. I'm not going to play ball with you right now. Maybe she'll give us some good questions next time. Yeah, let's tie it up there, because that way we've gotten all the way up to
we're up to 1800, and then we're going to talk about next time the Industrial Revolution, which changed things dramatically.
Yeah, we're still kind of reeling. We're still working through.
We're actually working through Industrial Revolution 2.0 right now.
Yeah, that's sort of what's happening. Yeah. And so anyway, great to see you all. Well, we're imagining to see you all.
Well, it's not hard. It's like a virtual thingy. Yeah.
Thank you, Father Mark.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you guys for joining us. We will see you next week.
See you next week.
And again, as always, catechumens depart.